Think about those moments when you've tried to connect with someone from a completely different background.
Uh-huh.
Did it ever feel like you were speaking different languages, even if you were, both using English?
Yeah, definitely.
Like getting to a real sense of shared understanding, of like belonging, felt surprisingly difficult.
Mm-hmm.
That feeling, that challenge of truly connecting across cultures, well, that's what we're diving deep into today.
Absolutely. We're exploring what it really takes to um, engage effectively with a new culture, to move beyond just watching from the sidelines to actually becoming someone who, well, belongs.
Right.
And our insights today, they come from some really experienced folks, missionaries, intercultural communication experts, names like E. Thomas and Elizabeth Brewster, Donald Larson, Jonathan Cortez, Phil Parshall.
Okay.
Now, yeah, their main focus was often cross-cultural mission work, but the principles, the core ideas they found, they're incredibly valuable for really anyone navigating unfamiliar cultural territory.
So not just for missionaries then.
Not at all. Whether you're joining a new diverse team at work, maybe moving to a city with a totally different vibe, or even just trying to understand a community nearby whose experiences are unlike your own, these ideas, they offer a kind of shortcut to building real, meaningful connections.
So we're tapping into the wisdom of people who've dedicated their lives to bridging these divides.
Exactly. Their experiences give us more than just theory.
Right, it's practical.
Yeah, actionable strategies, things that help foster genuine understanding and maybe help avoid those common missteps when we step into new cultural territory.
Okay, so our goal with this deep dive is to really unpack those key strategies, to help you listening figure out how to become someone who can truly belong in a new cultural context, fostering both understanding and, effective communication.
So let's start with a really foundational idea. This comes from the Brewsters, the concept of bonding.
Bonding, okay.
They draw this interesting parallel. It's like imprinting in animals, how they form strong attachments really early on.
Like baby ducks following the first thing they see.
Kind of, yeah. Or that early parent-infant attachment in humans. They talk about this critical period right after you enter a new culture.
A critical period. What do they mean by that?
Well, think about a newborn. They're suddenly in this world full of new sights, sounds, smells. They're incredibly alert, ready to connect.
Okay, I see the parallel. Entering a new culture is a sensory overload, too.
Exactly. New sights, sounds, smells, tastes, everything is different. And in that initial phase, there's this heightened awareness, this readiness, it seems, to connect, to bond.
You're wide open to the experience.
You really are. Your senses are just firing on all cylinders. And there's this window, this initial opportunity for really deep connection.
But there's a but in this.
Well, yeah, the Brewsters observed that often newcomers, whether missionaries or, anyone new to a culture, they tend to gravitate towards what's familiar.
Other expats, maybe? People who speak their language.
Precisely. Other expats, familiar faces, they called this the foray method, sort of dipping your toe in, but mostly sticking with your own group.
Okay, so what's the downside of doing that? Of mainly bonding with other outsiders?
Well, if you miss that initial window to connect deeply with the local community,
your understanding stays shallow.
Right. It can stay pretty surface level. And worse, you might start developing these outsider judgments, that whole why do they always do it this way kind of thinking.
Without really getting the why behind it.
Exactly. And fundamentally, you're just not building those deep, meaningful relationships within the community itself. You kind of remain on the outside looking in.
So you never really belong.
That's the risk. Without that early bonding, you're observing, maybe analyzing, but from a distance, you're not really immersing yourself.
So the Brewsters argue for the opposite.
Strongly, immediate immersion. From day one, the focus should be on building relationships with local people.
How? Like practical?
They really highlight things like living with a local family if possible, using local transportation, basically embedding yourself in the everyday rhythm of the community.
Wow, that sounds intense.
Yeah.
But I can see how it would be a fast track to understanding things from the inside out.
It is. And think about culture shock. How does this kind of immersion affect that?
I guess it makes it easier if you have people around you.
That's what they found. Bonding acts like a buffer. When you have those early connections, a local support network, the unfamiliar stuff feels less jarring, less threatening.
You have people to ask, hey, what's going on here?
Exactly. People to turn to for explanation, for help navigating new situations. And it creates that sense of home, even in a brand new place.
And it's not just about feeling better personally, right? The Brewsters mentioned it affects your actual work or goals, too.
Oh, absolutely. They share some really compelling stories, like how this early, deep connection can lead to more effective work, whatever that work is. And it can even speed up language learning significantly.
Really? How so?
Well, they cite an example from Bolivia. New language learners who prioritize living with local families, building relationships right away. They saw, I think it was over 30 people come to Christ through those relationships within their first 3 months.
Wow. In 3 months.
Yeah.
While learning the language.
Yeah. And they also point to, Mormon short-term missionaries. They often achieve pretty high language proficiency quickly because they're immediately immersed with local families. It just underlines the power of prioritizing those relationships right from the get-go.
It really sounds like this commitment to bonding has to be a very conscious choice. Like, you have to decide before you even go.
Definitely. The Brewsters were serious about it. Remember those conditions for their projects?
Yeah, live with locals, travel light, 20 kilos limit, use local transport only, learn the language and relationships. That's a huge commitment.
It is, and it directly tackles that fear people have, right? The fear of jumping into the deep end.
Sure, it seems risky.
Well, they'd argue there are risks either way. There might be some initial discomfort with immediate immersion, sure, but the potential long-term downsides of not becoming a belonger, feeling ineffective, isolated, maybe even leaving early, they frame those as much greater risks in the long run.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The power of bonding early.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears a bit. Donald Larson's work on roles.
Right. Larson talks about roles and this potential gap, this disconnect between how someone new sees themselves and how the local community actually perceives them.
You mentioned that story. The young man going to Southeast Asia.
Yeah, to teach the natives to farm. It just perfectly highlights that potential mismatch in attitude and expectation, a problematic attitude, really.
So how does the community usually see the newcomer, according to Larson?
He says they often slot the outsider into familiar roles based on the interaction. He identifies 3 main models. The schoolhouse.
Outsider as teacher.
Right. The marketplace.
Outsider as seller.
Uh-huh. And the courtroom.
Outsider as accuser, judge.
Yeah, accuser or judge. But Larson argues these roles where the outsider comes in with perceived authority or judgment are often pretty ineffective for building genuine connection.
But isn't it natural to want to share what you know or your beliefs? Why does he see those roles as problematic?
Well, the core issue is the power dynamic and the fact that you're still an outsider.
Okay.
Are people really open to being taught by someone who doesn't understand their daily life? Or buy from someone outside their economic system? Or accept judgment from someone not living by their rules? It often doesn't work well.
So what's the alternative?
Larson proposes this really vital principle: learner before teacher, buyer before seller, accused before accuser.
Flip the script. Start by receiving, not giving.
Exactly. Build that foundation of mutual understanding first.
Yeah.
Humility.
So what roles does he suggest work better? Roles that are viable for everyone, involve the individual, the locals, the sending group.
He outlines 3 key roles, and he sees them as a kind of progression: learner, trader, and storyteller.
Okay, learner first. What does that involve?
For roughly the first 3 months, he says, the primary focus should just be on being a learner. And the most visible symbol of that, language acquisition.
Learning the language shows you value them.
Precisely. It shows you respect them enough, you're committed enough to communicate in their way. It demonstrates you're there to understand them.
So it's not just like sitting in a classroom.
Oh, definitely not. Larson emphasizes active engagement from day one. He recommends daily, dedicated time with a language helper.
Not necessarily a formal teacher.
Right. More like a coach, a native speaker who can help with natural conversation, correct pronunciation, guide you. And crucially, get out there. Go into the community every day, try out what you're learning, initiate conversations, fully embrace being the one who's asking questions, the one who's learning from them.
And the goal for those first 3 months?
To get to a basic level of conversation, to be able to navigate simple interactions, and, importantly, to start feeling somewhat at home, less like a complete stranger.
Okay, that makes sense. Then, around month 4, you shift to trader. What are you trading? Not goods, presumably.
No, not usually physical goods. The trade here is about exchanging experiences, insights, perspectives.
How did that work?
Larson suggests using things like photos, maybe showing pictures from your home culture, talking about different ways people live, work, celebrate, struggle. It opens up conversations about their cultural practices, their livelihoods, their joys, their challenges.
So you become a sort of cultural bridge.
Exactly. fostering a two-way exchange. They learn about the wider world through you, and you learn more deeply about them. It's reciprocal.
And then step 3, around month 7, storyteller.
Right. This is where you begin to share simple narratives. That could include Bible stories, if that's your purpose, but also your own personal stories, your faith journey, perhaps.
But still as a learner and trader.
Absolutely. It's not like you drop the other roles. You continue learning, continue that exchange. Storytelling just becomes another layer, woven naturally into those ongoing relationships.
How are these roles typically received? Learner, trader, storyteller.
Larson suggests the local community usually responds pretty positively. People generally appreciate someone taking the time to learn and understand. The individual missionary often finds these roles enjoyable too. Less pressure, more connection.
What about the sending agencies or the existing missionary community?
That can be a bit more questionable, he notes, especially the trader role.
Why? Seems harmless?
Some more traditional groups might see exchanging, secular knowledge about different cultures as maybe not directly spiritual enough. It might not fit their expectations of what missionary work looks like.
Interesting. But Larson sees symbolic value, even in the learner role, right?
Huge value. He suggests it symbolizes really important things. Dependence, which requires humility, vulnerability, being willing to not know everything, identification, showing you want to be part of their world, even reconciliation, all powerful concepts.
And the trader role.
By sharing about the broader human experience, the diversity of humanity, it can actually reinforce the idea that the message, the gospel, is for all people, not just one culture. It broadens horizons. It's a really thoughtful framework for those initial interactions.
It really is. It emphasizes humility, starting from a place of receiving.
Yeah, learn first.
Which leads us perfectly into the LMP method for language learning.
Yeah.
Also from the Brewsters, right? E. Thomas and Elizabeth Brister.
That's right. Language acquisition made practical LMP.
And it ties right back into that bonding idea, learning directly from people.
Exactly. It's designed to facilitate language learning within the context of building those crucial relationships, fostering that early bonding.
So what are the core principles? What makes LMP work?
LMP is built on 3 really essential conditions. First, you've got to be living where the language is actually spoken, hearing it, and needing it every day.
Makes sense. Immersion.
Second, motivation. But they define motivation not just as, enthusiasm, which can fade. They see it as an act of the will, a conscious decision, a commitment.
Okay, willpower. And the third.
Knowing how to proceed, having a clear step-by-step process to follow. It's very hands-on, very field-oriented.
So how is this different from, say, taking a language class, which is how most adults try to learn a language?
Yeah, it's almost the opposite. Traditional classrooms often focus heavily on grammar rules, memorizing vocabulary lists and isolation.
Drills, verb conjugations.
Right. The Brewsters argue language isn't primarily an academic subject. It's more like a performance skill.
Like learning piano. Or tennis.
Exactly. You learn by doing it. Through constant practice, through real-world use. Think about it. Lots of people around the world speak multiple languages fluently without ever sitting in a formal language class. They just learned by living and using them.
So it's about getting out there and just trying, making mistakes.
Totally. They talk about adults needing to recapture a more childlike approach.
What does that mean? Less self-conscious.
Yeah. Kids experiment, they play with sounds, they aren't embarrassed by mistakes, they just try things out. Adults often get hung up on perfection, afraid of sounding silly.
Guilty as charged.
Right. LAMP encourages learners to push past that, to enjoy making new sounds, getting reactions. Even if people laugh sometimes at your early attempts, it's part of the process.
Okay, so what does a typical day look like if you're using LMP? Is it structured?
It is. There's a daily learning cycle with 4 parts. Prepare, practice, communicate, and evaluate.
Prepare, practice, communicate, evaluate. Okay?
The absolute key part, the one they stress over and over, is communicate what you know.
From day one.
Yeah.
Even if you only know hello.
Yes, right from the very beginning. You don't wait until you feel ready, because you'll never feel perfectly ready. You learn a few basic phrases.
And you go use them.
Immediately. Try them out in real situations, then you evaluate what worked, what didn't, what do I need next, then you prepare for the next interaction, practice it maybe with your language helper.
Ah, the language helper again.
Ah.
Not a teacher, but a coach.
Exactly. A native speaker who gives feedback, helps you practice pronunciation, helps you figure out what you need to say for everyday tasks. They're your guide in the real world, not just a textbook expert.
That makes so much sense. Embedding the learning in real life, real relationships. Okay, let's shift again, thinking about some of the maybe trickier aspects. Occupational identity, lifestyle, especially in places with restrictions.
Right. Jonathan Cortez tackles this, particularly with tent makers.
Tent makers,
Okay.
people using secular jobs to be in countries less open to overt mission work.
Exactly. And the core challenge is that bivocational thing, the tension between their official job and their, let's say, underlying purpose or passion.
Here's that story about Bill.
Yeah, Bill and the customs official. His luggage tag basically gave away a potential religious connection, raising immediate suspicion. It highlights how carefully you have to navigate that dual identity.
And it's not just external scrutiny, right?
Right.
People wondering what you're really doing there.
No, there's also that internal pressure, feeling maybe dishonest or less than authentic if you can't be fully open about your primary motivation.
That must take a toll.
It really can. Cortez stresses how important it is for tent makers to have a really solid sense of their own identity and calling before they even arrive. If your cover story, your occupation, seems flimsy or doesn't match your lifestyle,
People see through it.
it can easily lead to suspicion. Why does the English teacher live in such a big house or seem to have so much free time? That kind of thing.
But Cortez still makes a case, theologically, for being there, for bearing witness even in these tougher places. How does he square that circle? Respecting laws, but staying true to a calling.
He frames it carefully. It's about ultimate allegiance, yes, but also wisdom and deep cultural sensitivity. He makes a clear distinction between sharing your beliefs appropriately, relationally, versus disruptive or disrespectful proselytizing that ignores local laws and cultural feelings.
So how do you manage the pressures?
Well, externally, he suggests having a genuine and relevant secular job really helps, something you're actually qualified for and engaged in. Internally, that pressure of feeling maybe deceptive, that requires a really strong personal conviction, a deep sense of calling, and spiritual authority to navigate those feelings.
Okay, this whole lifestyle question, it also ties into what Phil Partial discusses, right?
Yeah.
Especially money and housing.
Yes, Partial gets into the nitty-gritty of missionary lifestyle, and it's often a point of tension.
The whole Western standard of living
Yeah.
versus identifying with the local community's reality.
Exactly. That observation he shares from the Korean missionary in Pakistan.
About the image of comfort being a barrier.
Yeah, that it can unintentionally create this image of privilege and distance. It really sticks with you.
It does. It must be a hard balance to strike.
It is. Partial lays out the different viewpoints. Some advocate for extreme simplicity, really living at the local level. He mentions historical examples like ascetic Irish monks or Donald McGavran pushing for missionaries to live very basically.
But others argue you need a certain standard for health, family, effectiveness.
Right. So Partial doesn't prescribe one single answer.
What does he suggest then?
He emphasizes a prayerful, context-aware approach. You have to acknowledge the huge impact your financial footprint can have on perception. But ultimately, each person, each family, needs to figure out their own needs, while really striving to live as closely as possible to the people they're there to serve.
Without it causing, like, health problems or hindering their actual work.
Exactly. Finding that balance. He even floats the idea of maybe living more simply in rural areas, but having occasional trips to cities for supplies or a break.
What about mission compounds, those gated communities we sometimes see?
Partial is generally critical of them. He sees them as potential, often significant barriers to real connection.
Why? Safety. Community for the missionaries.
While those might be factors, he argues they often prevent the kind of daily, casual interaction that builds deep understanding and trust. He shares a personal story, living right next door to a Muslim family in Bangladesh.
And that proximity made a difference.
A huge difference. Those everyday encounters, sharing life side by side, fostered friendship in a way that living separately in a compound just wouldn't allow. His main point is simple. Where you choose to live should, first and foremost, help you connect with the people you're trying to reach.
Makes sense. Location, 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 but for relationships.
Pretty much.
And Partial also stresses it's not just about the external's money house, it's also about what's going on inside.
Absolutely. He talks about the need for ongoing intellectual engagement, continuous learning. The world changes, cultures change. We need to keep learning.
Especially collaboration between older and younger generations.
Yes, openness to new ideas, new approaches. But maybe most fundamentally, he hammers home the importance of attitude.
Attitude, meaning.
Empathy, genuine care for the local people. That story he tells about his Hindu neighbor whose cow died.
Oh, right. What happened?
The neighbor was devastated. It was a huge economic loss. Partial just went and sat with him, shared his grief, showed simple human compassion.
Didn't preach. Didn't offer solution.
No, just sat with him in his sadness. And that act of empathy built a profound bridge. It showed he cared. Partial insists that authentic love, genuine concern, that has to be the driving force. Not programs, not strategies, but love.
That's powerful. Finally, Partial looks at the New Testament model, particularly Paul. What's the key takeaway there?
He really focuses on Paul's approach: establish local churches, empower local leaders, and then move on.
Move on, not stay and run things.
Right. He draws on thinkers like Leslie Newbegin, George Peters, Roland Allen. They all highlight how Paul seemed focused on planting communities that could sustain themselves, led by locals. Then he'd move to the next place.
How does that contrast with some modern approaches?
Partial suggests some modern missions can fall into the trap of maintaining long-term control, creating dependency rather than empowerment. He advocates for that Pauline model: establish, empower, and then entrust it to local hands, resisting the urge to stay in charge indefinitely. Keep moving, keep planting.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground here. Bonding, roles, language, lifestyle, attitude, empowerment.
Yeah, quite a journey through these perspectives.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's distill it. What are the absolute core principles someone listening can take away, whether they're doing mission work or just, trying to connect better in our diverse world?
I think a few key things stand out. First, that critical importance of being intentional right from the start, about connecting deeply when you enter any new cultural space. Don't wait.
Make bonding the priority.
Yes. Second, adopt that posture of humility. Be a learner before you try to be a teacher. Ask questions before you give answers. That builds rapport like nothing else.
Learner, trader, storyteller.
Right. Third, be mindful of how you're perceived, your lifestyle, your actions. Strive for genuine empathy and care. That resonates more than any program.
It's the attitude the love Pershel talked about.
Exactly. And finally, this idea of empowerment, whether it's in mission or any collaboration, aim to build capacity in others. Avoid creating dependence. Trust local knowledge and leadership.
These feel so universally applicable, really. It really makes you think about your own interactions, doesn't it?
It does. That basic human desire to connect, to belong, it cuts across all cultures.
So, as we finish up, maybe a final thought for everyone listening, something to chew on.
Okay.
Think about the next time you find yourself in an unfamiliar setting. Maybe a new neighborhood, a different social group, even just talking to someone with a very different background. What's one small step, just one thing you could do to adopt more of that learner mindset we talked about? How might consciously choosing to understand their perspective first before jumping in with your own, how might that change the whole interaction?
That's a great challenge.
It's just a reminder, I guess, that building those bridges of understanding, it often starts with just one small intentional step towards genuine connection.
Yeah.
Listening first.